Part 1: The Silent Architects of Human Thought. It begins in the quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from isolation, but the quiet that lives behind the eyes of someone who sees more than they say. You've met these people, even if you didn't notice at first. They don't fill rooms with sound. They fill them with presence. And when they speak, something deep inside you pauses because there's weight in their words, not from volume, but from vision. History is filled with wars, inventions, revolutions, and empires. But beneath all that noise, there have always been minds so silent, so inwardly vast, that they shaped the way we see reality without ever needing to shout. We think of Socrates walking barefoot through Athens, questioning everyone. But what we forget is that Socrates claimed to know nothing. He was not a preacher. He was a listener, a provoker. His silence was his weapon. He once said, "The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing." What kind of mind does it take to admit that in a world obsessed with opinions? What kind of strength does it require to not speak when everyone else is screaming for attention? That is the beginning of true philosophical power. It's easy to mistake silence for weakness or inaction for apathy. But we forget that many of the most transformative ideas in human history came not from the loud, but from the still. Think of Immanuel Kant, who never traveled more than a few dozen miles from his home in Königsberg. Yet his mind traveled past time and space, reshaping metaphysics itself. He said, "Science is organized knowledge, wisdom is organized life." And in his rigid daily walks, in the monotony of his routine, he was building the very scaffolding of how we understand morality, perception, and autonomy. Not with a war cry, but with a whisper. But why do we overlook these minds? Why do we value the loud, the charismatic, the forceful over those who sit with their thoughts for decades before releasing a single line? Perhaps because we are afraid of what silence might reveal. In silence, there is no distraction. In silence, we meet ourselves. And many of us are not ready for that confrontation. But the quiet minds of history were not afraid. They sought that confrontation. They lived in it. They made it their home. And from that place, they changed everything. There's a strange tension inside all of us, the desire to be seen and the fear of being truly known. The quietest minds of history didn't seek recognition. They sought reality. They asked questions most people would never dare to voice. They sat with uncertainty, with paradox, with the unbearable weight of truth without answers. That is not weakness. That is intellectual courage. And it takes a certain kind of person to choose that path, not for fame, not for legacy, but because they can't not ask. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself, when was the last time you sat in silence, not to escape, but to listen? What did you hear? Was it the noise of your thoughts or the echo of something deeper? Because that's where all great philosophy begins. Not with debate, not with books, but with listening to the silence inside your own mind. That's the birthplace of wonder. And wonder, as Plato said, is the beginning of wisdom.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Consider Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of the most enigmatic minds of the 20th century. He published only 2 major works, and they contradicted each other so profoundly that scholars still argue over what he truly believed. But Wittgenstein wasn't trying to be understood. He was trying to understand language itself, the very tool we use to shape reality. He once wrote, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." What if silence isn't a lack of thought, but a recognition that some truths are beyond language? That one sentence has shattered the certainty of thousands of thinkers. Because it challenges us to admit, maybe not everything can be known. Maybe not everything should be spoken. And maybe the greatest truths are the ones we feel in the quiet corners of our consciousness, truths that cannot be reduced to words, only live through awareness. Let's go even deeper. What if the reason we ignore the quietest minds is because they hold up a mirror we're not ready to look into? They don't distract us with charisma. They don't entertain. They reflect. And in that reflection, we're forced to see our own noise, our own restlessness, our own fear of being alone with our thoughts. Blaise Pascal once wrote, "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." What a terrifyingly accurate observation. And yet, how many of us can truly say we've mastered that simple act? The quietest minds are not passive. They are precision instruments. They observe patterns the rest of us miss. They notice the subtle contradiction hidden in a sentence, the unspoken assumption behind a belief. They are not trying to win arguments. They are trying to see clearly. And in that clarity, they often say more in one sentence than most people say in a lifetime. Take Simone Weil, who wrote in obscurity, lived in poverty, and died young. Her writings on suffering, attention, and grace are some of the most powerful in modern philosophy. She said, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity." What does that even mean? It means that to truly pay attention to another person, to a thought, to a moment, is to give the deepest part of yourself. Not your opinions, not your reactions, but your presence. And that presence, that radical attention, is what makes the quietest minds so rare. They are not distracted. They are devoted to truth, to clarity, to the terrifying beauty of thought unclouded by ego. They are not perfect. They are often tormented, isolated, misunderstood. But in their silence, they build worlds. They construct mental cathedrals. And when we enter those cathedrals, if we dare, we find something waiting for us. Ourselves, stripped of performance, stripped of noise, stripped of illusion. Now let me ask you something that may change the way you see your own mind. What if your silence was not emptiness, but potential? What if everything you've been searching for, meaning, clarity, peace, is already inside you, waiting in the stillness you've been too afraid to enter? What would happen if you stopped trying to be impressive and started trying to be honest? Not with others, with yourself. Would you recognize the sound of your own truth? Because that's what the quietest minds have always done. They weren't born with answers. They were born with questions. And the courage to sit with those questions for years or decades without rushing to resolve them. They knew that the mind is not a machine. It is a mirror. And if you polish it enough, not with noise, but with stillness, it begins to reflect something sacred. So the next time you feel like you have to speak, prove, explain, perform, pause. Ask yourself, am I speaking from clarity or from fear? Am I reacting or am I responding from depth? And if you don't know, choose silence. Because silence is not absence. Silence is space. And space is where thought becomes wisdom. The secret lives of history's quietest minds are not really secrets. They are invitations. Invitations to slow down, to listen, to feel thought move through you, to let awareness become your teacher. And if you accept that invitation, you'll begin to see what they saw, not just the world, but the architecture of consciousness itself. Part 2, the inner universe. How solitude shaped the greatest thinkers. The deeper we travel into the quietest minds of history, the more we realize they were not escaping the world, they were rebuilding it from the inside out. Solitude was not their prison. It was their workshop. They were not antisocial. They were hyper-attuned to the inner threads of thought, emotion, and perception. They withdrew not to isolate, but to illuminate. And what they illuminated was not just abstract knowledge, it was the unseen patterns of human nature, society, and the self. One of the deepest examples is Baruch Spinoza, a man excommunicated from his community, living a quiet life as a lens grinder. He lived in obscurity, barely published in his lifetime, and yet his ideas reshaped the very notion of God, ethics, and existence. He wrote, "The more you struggle to live, the less you live. Give up the notion that you must be sure of what you are doing. Just take action." His philosophy wasn't loud, but it was relentlessly precise. He believed the divine was not a person, but the totality of existence itself. And from that premise, he created a system of thought so radical, it would later influence Einstein and generations of thinkers. Spinoza's mind was silent but expansive. He didn't need applause. He needed coherence. And coherence is born not from noise, but from the discipline of solitude. We often think solitude weakens us, but in the right hands, solitude sharpens the soul like a blade. When we stop trying to be understood, we start understanding. And when we stop trying to be seen, we begin to see everything. Now ask yourself, when have you last chosen solitude not because you were forced to, but because you were ready to meet yourself? Most people avoid solitude because it confronts them with the parts of the self they've abandoned. But the quietest minds, those who walked away from the crowd, made a different choice. They sat with discomfort. They sat with contradiction. They sat with the unbearable silence until it began to speak back. Carl Jung understood this. He believed that the unconscious was not a dark pit, but a rich field of symbols, dreams, and archetypes. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes, he said. Jung descended into his own psyche, not as a scholar, but as an explorer of the soul's terrain. He painted, dreamed, wrote down visions, and described the process as a descent into madness and also into wisdom. What he discovered was that the quiet mind is not empty. It is alive with symbols. It is a landscape of myth and memory. And when we learn to read it, we begin to understand not just ourselves, but the entire human condition. But this kind of quiet is not glamorous. It does not trend. It does not post. It is sacred. And sacred space demands sacrifice. The sacrifice of noise, of distraction, of comparison, the sacrifice of being popular in order to become authentic. That is the choice the quietest minds made, and it's the choice that invites us now to do the same. Virginia Woolf, another quiet revolutionary, wrote with such internal brilliance that her thoughts still vibrate inside literature today. She once said, "I am rooted, but I flow." Her prose was not loud. It was interior music. She captured the subtle shifts of consciousness, the waves of thought that most minds miss. Her genius was not in screaming new ideas, but in articulating the inner weather of being human. Depression, joy, loneliness, connection. Her quiet mind didn't ignore emotion, it translated it into language so precise it feels like thought given form. Woolf's inner world was not an escape from life, it was a deeper form of participation. This is the paradox of the quietest minds. They often seem distant, but they are deeply engaged. They are not detached. They are immersed in essence. They aren't trying to win arguments. They're trying to touch what is true. And that is not something one can do in a hurry. It takes spaciousness, mental, emotional, existential. Consider this. What if your mind was not meant to be constantly stimulated, but to be stretched in silence? What if boredom is not a failure, but a doorway? What if behind that boredom is a new layer of self you've never met, because the noise has always been too loud? These are not idle questions. These are the questions the quietest minds have lived into for centuries, and they are still waiting for you to ask them. Friedrich Nietzsche, often mischaracterized as a loud, intense voice of rebellion, was actually one of the loneliest minds in philosophy. He wrote in pain, in exile, often in isolation, and yet he gave birth to ideas that still challenge the very structure of society. "You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star," he wrote. That chaos was not noise, it was inner fire. And fire, when contained in silence, becomes vision. Nietzsche didn't run from his solitude. He set it on fire, and from that blaze he forged new ways of thinking about morality, willpower, and the meaning of existence. We often say we want clarity, but are we willing to pay the price? Are we willing to let go of the constant need to be entertained, affirmed, or distracted? Because the truth is, clarity comes after the discomfort. It comes after you've sat long enough in the silence to let the mind settle. Like muddy water, it clears only when you stop stirring. But the modern world doesn't want you to stop. It wants you engaged constantly, endlessly, because a quiet mind cannot be marketed to. A quiet mind cannot be manipulated. A quiet mind knows itself. That's the great threat of the silent thinker. They cannot be controlled. They have created an inner world more vast than the outer one. And from that inner world, they draw strength, wisdom, and creativity that no algorithm can replicate. So the question becomes, are you ready to build that inner world? Are you willing to become a person who doesn't need to be told what to think, because you've learned how to think for yourself? This isn't just philosophy. This is psychological freedom. A quiet mind is not a passive mind, it's a disciplined one. It sees the impulse to react and pauses. It witnesses emotion without being consumed. It hears the chaos of the world and chooses stillness, not because it's better, but because it's awake. And awakeness is the beginning of agency. So let me ask you now, with full seriousness, what would your life look like if your mind became your sanctuary, not your battlefield? What if your thoughts were not your enemies, but your guides? What if, instead of trying to quiet your mind, you befriended it? That is what the quietest minds have done. They have not silenced thought. They have fused with it. They have made peace with the complexity of consciousness, and from that peace, they have created ideas that outlive time itself. The secret lives of these thinkers are not secrets because they were hidden. They are secrets because so few dared to go where they went. But the path is open, and it begins with a single act, the choice to listen, not to the world, not to the noise, but to the deep, slow, steady voice of your own interior life. Part 3. The Invisible Revolution. Quiet minds that change the world. By now we've seen how the quietest minds did not retreat from the world, they redefined it from the inside. They lived in solitude, not because they feared people, but because they were in intimate dialogue with truth. But here's the twist. These silent architects of thought didn't just shape philosophy and psychology. They shaped civilization, not with armies, not with speeches, but with ideas whose power was so raw, so undeniable, that they outlasted empires. Consider the case of Søren Kierkegaard, often seen pacing the streets of Copenhagen, writing in solitude, lost in thoughts that made others uncomfortable. A man racked with anxiety, riddled with paradoxes, and yet he gave us the foundation of existentialism. He wrote, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." This wasn't poetry, it was medicine. It was a roadmap for the kind of soul that feels lost in a world that moves too fast. Kierkegaard's mind was a battlefield between despair and faith, and in that silent war he uncovered the truth we all run from, that freedom terrifies us, and that to truly choose our life is to take responsibility for our existence. He never stood on a stage, never led a movement, but his words laid the soil for thinkers like Camus, Sartre, and Frankl, who later helped an entire generation grapple with meaning in the shadow of war and genocide. This is the subtle revolution of the quiet mind. It moves beneath history, beneath politics, beneath headlines, and eventually surfaces when the world is ready to hear what it once ignored. And what about Emily Dickinson? A reclusive poet, writing lines of unbearable clarity from the quiet of her room. "The brain is wider than the sky," she wrote. And now we know neurologically, metaphorically, spiritually, she was right. Dickinson didn't need an audience. Her mind was an universe. Her solitude was not tragic, it was cosmic. She showed us that the interior life was not a retreat, but a form of flight. If you've ever felt like your thoughts were too big for the world to hold, remember, so did she. And she didn't shrink. She wrote anyway. And now, across centuries and continents, her words are still alive. Why? Because they were real, real thought, unfiltered by performance, real emotion, untouched by social expectation, real awareness, birthed not from noise, but from noticing. So ask yourself, what have you noticed lately that no one else has? What thought have you had that felt too strange, too inconvenient, too true to say out loud? What if that thought is not a burden, but a beginning? The beginning of your own quiet revolution. The whisper that could one day become a roar, not because you shouted, but because you meant it. The world has always been changed by those who were willing to go inward when everyone else went outward. Abraham Maslow, the father of humanistic psychology, didn't just study behavior, he studied potential. He wanted to understand what made certain people self-actualize, to rise beyond survival and begin to create, to love, to transcend. He found that these people were not the loudest. They were often deeply introspective. They lived in peak experiences, moments of profound connection, awe, and inner clarity. These were not mystical accidents. They were cultivated through attention, curiosity, and solitude. Maslow once said, "What is necessary to change a person is to change his awareness of himself." That is the quietest revolution of all. Not changing the world through force, but through awareness. And when enough people do that, the entire field of consciousness shifts, not because they shouted louder, but because they listened deeper. In a time where everyone is speaking, few are thinking. In a time where everyone is watching, few are seeing. And in a time where everyone is performing, few are being. The quiet minds of history were not better than us. They were simply braver in their solitude. They dared to sit with the uncomfortable. They dared to ask the questions that had no answers. And in doing so, they found a kind of peace that doesn't depend on approval, only on truth. Think of Thomas Merton, a Trappist monk and mystic who wrote from his monastery about war, injustice, and the sacredness of the human soul. He said, "We are not at peace with others because we are not at peace with others, peace with ourselves." His silence was political. His solitude was spiritual. Merton didn't hide from the world, he refused to echo it. He believed that silence was the only space where the soul could be heard. And in that silence, he discovered a voice so universal it could speak across religions, ideologies, and time. What if your silence could do the same? What if your pause, your retreat, your refusal to rush was not weakness, but preparation? What if the real revolution is not in overthrowing systems, but in overthrowing the illusions within yourself? Because once you're free inside, no system can truly own you. That's the liberation the quiet minds discovered. Not freedom of speech, freedom of thought. We are used to noise. We are addicted to stimulation. But the most powerful breakthroughs come not when we are overwhelmed, but when we are empty enough to receive. The quietest minds were not empty because they lacked ideas. They were empty because they had cleared room for truth to arrive. So here's the final question, and it may be the most important one you've ever asked yourself. If you stop trying to be seen, what would you finally be able to see? If you stop performing, explaining, defending, what inside you would finally be heard? That is where your real mind lies. Not in the noise, in the noticing. We began this journey with a paradox: how minds that few people noticed ended up changing everything. But now we understand why. Because attention doesn't always go where truth lives. Truth lives in the deep, in the slow, in the unseen. And those who dare to go there, who dare to live there, become the quiet architects of a new world. You don't have to be loud to make an impact. You don't have to be seen to leave a legacy. You don't have to be understood to be true. You just have to be awake, fully, painfully, beautifully awake. And you have to be willing to sit in the silence until your mind becomes clear enough to carry something real. That's the secret. That's the path. That's the invitation. Now go, not to speak, but to listen. And when you return from the silence, bring back something the world forgot it needed. Yourself, unedited, unfiltered, unafraid.